The Four Hidden Dynasties, Part 2. In this lecture, we're going to talk about these four hidden dynasties and how they came to power, and where they are taking us. In the first half of this message, we identified the four dynasties as the educational system, the economy system, the political system, and as the religious system. But what gives these four their power, besides deception? First and foremost, they are allowed by God. They are a test, if you will. They are the negative part of God's plan. But they are also empowered by man's self-righteousness and man's pride in his own wisdom. And they are enabled by ignorance of truth and by turning away from God's counsel. Now you can almost date to the day when the power of the four hidden dynasties blooms and began to come to full power. It was a calculated plan that has been in place for some time, even back from biblical times. It comes down from the mark set upon Cain, a mark carried down through generations of Cain's progeny. If you don't understand this, I have a lecture called Satan's Seed, Cain's Progeny, which may help you. What was it that Cain did that displeased God? I mean, besides slaying his brother righteous Abel. Well, before he slew Abel, Cain was found to be greedy and self-serving and jealous. In the Old Testament times, when people made a sacrifice or an offering to God to atone for sins, they were supposed to give the best that they had as offering. The best lamb, or the best bull, or the best of their crops, their first fruits. The best was supposed to go to God. But when Cain made his offering, or rather his sacrifice to God, Cain kept the best for himself and gave God what was left. And God was displeased with Cain and his offering. And so Cain was jealous of his brother Abel because God was pleased with Abel's offering, and Cain killed his brother. This translated on down. In the time of Jesus Christ, Cain's offspring, who had infiltrated and merged themselves into the tribes of Israel and Judah, had become the chief priests, the scribes and Pharisees of the church at the time of Christ. This is why Christ stormed in and overchanged the money changers' tables, because they had turned the church into a money racket. Not only that, when Jesus came to them, they denied him, they called him a heretic and spat on him, and they plotted and eventually brought about his crucifixion. Now again, I said we could date this. In the year 1948, Israel became a nation again. And with the birth of this new state of Israel came the fig tree generation spoken of by Jesus Christ, where the good and the bad fig were planted together as a nation. That generation that would not pass away until all was fulfilled, meaning the end of this earth age, the end of the flesh age. If we look back at how things were previous to 1948, we can see when the downfall of civilization, Western civilization, began. World War II began in 1938, and America entered into it in 1941. America was then an independent sovereign nation, which became a superpower during that World War, because America had to industrialize and mechanize and step up to fight the Nazi threat. But from 1948 to the present, America underwent a revolutionary change. A change from being a pure Christian nation and a change in morality, a change from being a nation of true values, true American values, to what it has been becoming since 1948. Which is to say, a government of corruption, self-serving, ruled by knee-jerk reaction and feel-good politics. Feel-good politics that seem to be the right thing to those who are uninformed. A nation that panders to whiners. A nation of rebellious youth and of hypocrisy. A nation of propaganda and innuendo. And these forces were in play before 1948, but 1948 is the benchmark by which we can see the change, the eruption of man's pridefulness and the erosion of morality. As we entered the 50s, the nation became more rebellious. Rock and roll was born. Americans, which had only a few years earlier returned from war, came home to their women, and of course nature took its course, and a new generation was born, the baby boomers. A generation which would usher in the radical 60s, in which everything began to be overturned. America was now joined to the United Nations. This would be the first building blocks of the global New World Order, the birth of one-worldism, the one-world system. And the threat of underground communism loomed large, as we were now in a Cold War with Russia. The youth began to cut their teeth on being rebellious. The greaser appeared. Blue jeans, leather jackets. The music suddenly began to be more sexual. The moves and dances more risque. The cars were chromed and winged and fast. And with each progressive year, the music got louder and harder. The youth got more rebellious. And while music only played a small role, it was liberating. You might even say it was the anthem of the new rebellion and the self-indulgent youth that were coming of age. Likewise, the movies got a little more violent. Not yet like the modern gore and violence which is on TV and filth, but still with the message of rebellion and the beginnings of counterculturalism, like the first biker movies and the rebel without a cause genre movies. As we approach the 1960s, the beatnik generation sprang up. You might even call them the precursors to the hippies. Drugs began to be the new high. In the 20s, 30s, and 40s, it was beer, whiskey, and cigarettes. But now, marijuana made its grand entrance. Even though it had been around for a little while before this, it was now coming to the top steps of its discovery. And America entered the Vietnam War. America was also having difficulty with race relations. And in Russia, Nikita Khrushchev said that America's grandchildren would one day live under communist rule, that communism would be achieved peaceably. It seems his words might have been prophetical, judging by what is going on in America this day. As we reached the mid-60s, a new hatred appeared in America. The high school and college age kids began to rise up against the system, which they saw as corrupt. Sex, drugs, and rock and roll began to be the most coveted things of youth. Drugs like acid and cocaine made their first appearance. Rock DJs stirred youth into angry frenzies with anti-war sentiments. Protest and peace marches laced with drugs and sex began to be the mission of youth. In ignorance, the easily moved to anger spat on returning soldiers and called them baby killers as they returned from Vietnam. And I say in ignorance because the hostile counterculture youth at that time had no idea what the Vietnam War was really about, nor did they really care. Because in their rebellious self-righteousness, they didn't stop to consider what it was about. They only knew that peace, love, and good times were the order of the day, and the fad, and the popular ideals. And anything contrary to that was worth hating, regardless of cause or reason. Not to mention that many were duped into believing every falsehood spoon-fed to them by the media. And popular rebellious rock icons began to experiment with drugs and be seen as ultra cool and cutting edge for doing so. These rock icons, in turn, gave voice to the counterculture and echoed its message. And they were applauded and revered for doing so. They caused polarity due to their fame. Their big names forwarded the cause. Many of them were so revered till they openly uttered communal, socialist, and Marxist ideals to massive crowds and in their music, which a few years earlier in America would have gotten them booed off stage. But now, instead, they were cheered because they stood for change. They stood for being radical. It was an about-face from the norm, and it was very romantic to the youth. And I will give an example of this polarity. And this example will offend some, I'm sure. If they are offended by this example, then they aren't really listening to my words or the example I'm giving, but will be moved with knee-jerk reaction and be a victim of this polarity. Nevertheless, here is an example. By this polarity, the change I was speaking of, it was made manifest during the 60s in some of the events of the life of John Lennon, the famous Beatle. And these events will show how America and views had changed. Now, in the year 1964, Lennon had made the comment that now we are more famous and known about than Jesus Christ. This outraged many, and there was an immediate backlash. Beatles albums were burned, and for a short time, America's radio stations, some of them, would not play the Beatles' music. But within 2 years, America had done a complete about-face again, and the Beatles were bigger than ever. And John Lennon used his fame to become one of the biggest voices and mouthpieces for the counterculture movement. This was in part because the counterculture movement grafted itself onto the peace and love and drugs and anti-war movement. While John Lennon was one of the most brilliant musicians and songwriters that the world has ever known, he was also of the socialist Marxist philosophy. And though he did not support the atrocities and the oppression of communist governments such as the Soviet Union or China, he did wholeheartedly embrace Marxist idealism. Probably the most famous song he ever wrote is a Marxist anthem that came about in 1971. The song is called Imagine. If you really listen to the words of the song, you will get the message. The words say, imagine there's no heaven. It's easy if you try. No hell below us, above us only sky. Imagine all the people living for today. Imagine there's no countries. It isn't hard to do. Nothing to kill or die for, and no religion too. Imagine all the people living life in peace. You may say I'm a dreamer, but I'm not the only one. I hope someday you'll join us and the world can live as one. Imagine no possessions. I wonder if you can. No need for greed or hunger, a brotherhood of man. Imagine all the people sharing all the world. Now, this is not the end of the song, but you get the drift. These words on the surface seem harmless, only an opinion. But they illustrate the fleshly values of the counterculture and its short-sightedness. The counterculture wanted peace, 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 even if it meant the sacrifice of principles and morals, and even at the cost of freedom. And the lyrics of this song, Imagine, do imagine. They imagine that there's no hell and no heaven, no religion, a brotherhood of man. Imagine there's no countries, living for now. This is a one-world vision. Peace at any cost. Fight for nothing, stand for nothing, believe in nothing, and have peace. Now, I am all for free speech, and this man, whose music I personally loved, was wonderful. But as far as this song, what good is it? Life without God or Christ or heaven? What would be the meaning? What is so wonderful about imagining life in the human flesh alone? To live and to struggle, to hurt, to get hurt, to get old and to die, and since there is no heaven, to blink into nothing? Where would this world be with no religion, without Christ's words, without God's laws and commandments? The values of right and morality. After all, it is not religion that is wrong or evil. It is those who twist religion to extremes, to use religion to mean something other than was intended, to abuse their influence and power. No, it is not religion that is bad, but what men do in the name of religion, out of their own hearts, which is evil. But since they represent a religion, now the religion is to blame instead of themselves, at least in the eyes of some. And why imagine that there is no heaven? After all, God is the author of peace. Jesus Christ is the author of love and righteousness. Is peace alone so wonderful that man should sacrifice all his values, beliefs, and all of his principles to lay down his weapons just to have no conflict? That won't work for several reasons. First of all, the nature of the flesh. Man has to have something to uphold, to cling to stand for, to protect. And even if some did lay down all weapons, others would seize them up and take control. Then we would be subject to their whims. And the very nature of man gives him reasons and causes to fight for what he believes in. Peace is a wonderful idea, but not if it means sacrificing our faith, morals, and principles just to get along and just to attain peace. Now, I know that some who are listening to this, if they're still listening, are no longer hearing my words now because in their mind I have spoken against such a wonderful rock icon as Lennon, who touched millions of hearts with his music and with his fame. And it takes them back to the memories of their youth, the good times. And this proves my point, that they cannot see the forest for the trees. In other words, for some now, my words are meaningless. They have closed their ears because they respect this musician and all he meant to them, and all he came to be to them in their youth and good times. And now, because I have said something that seems detrimental in their minds, the truth no longer matters. I have spoken negatively of him in their mind, and nothing else matters now. They will now be spiteful because they revere him, and anyone that believes that what I have said even sounds like something against his good name will close their minds to hearing anything further. And that's what I mean by polarity. And this happens even now amongst the big rock icons and the big Hollywood notables, because they inspire people to want to be just like them and then reveal their true colors as to what they are, leftists. Now, if we look at the appearance of John Lennon when the Beatles burst onto the scene in 63, 64, and then look at his appearance just 2 to 3 short years later after he discovered drugs and delved into Eastern Hindu mysticism, you see a radical change in the man, from a brilliant young entertainer who was adored by millions to a more radical mouthpiece for the counterculture, who used his fame and notoriety to give voice to the cause of peace regardless of the cost. But because it was the times and his messages spoke to youth, the youth of that time still hold to that message. And again, this same weapon is used today by Hollywood. Hollywood gives us characters to love and to make us cry, to make us laugh. Characters we want to be like and wish we could be. And as we grow to love these characters, they reveal themselves to us. And what comes out on TV today, the characters are more left of center. But they're made to be as though they represent the ordinary, everyday mainstream. These TV characters most often never take sides on any big issue. They're most often minus of religion because it's never mentioned of. And they take pro-left jabs and stances. And 9 out of 10 times the stars who play these characters are pro-left wing. And it's a double whammy. Not only is the character in the show left of center, but also the person who plays the character themselves is left of center. Or considers themselves liberal. Which translated by today's version is not liberal, but leftist. And so, due to the character and the star who plays the character being oriented politically to the left, Americans who love the character and the star will strive to be more like them and will more easily and readily agree with them because of their fame, because of their notoriety. And if you don't think so, just look at how fanatical some people can be and act over rock stars and television stars. Lennon's transformation was an illustration or a poster for what happened in the world at that time, and where the real revolution, or this so-called liberality, began to take power and push out the old order. It was during these years that violence escalated on American campuses and in the poor and minority sections of America. And some of those who preached peace and love with one side of their mouths pushed radical and even terrorist campaigns here in the United States. And some of those who led this overturning are now deeply entrenched in politics and have influence and voice over who gets elected. And I will allude back to this as we continue. But now let's leave the 60s behind and move on to the 70s. We enter the 70s with a bang. Cars are all of a sudden less powerful and more fuel efficient due to the oil crisis. The disco movement is fixing to be given birth. Cocaine is going to become king, with worse and more powerful drugs to soon follow. And with disco will come transvesticism. People will become openly gay and step out of the closet. They will become political and plot their way to power. And sex in the 70s is everything. America doesn't yet know that in the 80s, AIDS will hit like a hurricane. But for the time being in the 70s, there's only the threat of the communicable diseases like VD. And in the 70s, TV was becoming more political. It was more now than just entertainment. It had a message. Shows like MASH and Maude and All in the Family arrived with their left-of-center jabs and messages. The left-leaning media was spinning the truth whichever way they saw fit. And censorship was on the way out. It was being limited and cut back. And it was about to fall by the wayside in lieu of more sexual and violent TV and movies and music. Music was becoming even harder. Heavy metal and punk will soon burst onto the scene. And the radicals of the 60s, now in the 70s, were getting educated. They were buying into technology. Before long, they would help to start the computer age. They had stopped protesting because Vietnam was over, and they were now plotting their rise to power and their takeover. And they are cunning. They would hide their true agenda with righteous-seeming acts and pursuits that would look noble. They would go political and run for office. They would be the first to go green with the environment. They would bring up groups like Greenpeace. Greenpeace, which did very good things like saving the whales and preaching a clean environment. But at the same time, under the surface, would slow progress, would stifle the economy by whining about coal and nuclear power and gas-burning vehicles. And once these former hippies, counterculture, and leftists began being elected to office, they set up their own network. They started their own buddy-buddy system. They would cost taxpayers millions by using scare tactics and imagined threats, which the simple, everyday, uninformed American with good intention and misplaced apathy would eagerly bite hook, line, and sinker. And as these leftists began building their base, they became lawyers, environmentalists, teachers, college professors, and politicians. They would mesh into the arty left of center media with the ease of a knife through warm butter. They would buy radio stations and start newspapers and take over trusted iconic newspapers that already existed. In short, they were on a mission, an unspoken and hidden mission with an agenda. Revolution, change, and one day, socialism. So let's now move on into the 80s. As we entered the 80s, the leftist plans are well on track. They have given rise to a new form of entertainment, the music video. MTV is born. New cable channels appeared, HBO, Showtime. All sorts of pay channels which were filled with things you couldn't see on regular TV. The music began to reach its pinnacle of hardness. Heavy metal and big hair was king, along with the self-centered narcissistic attitudes of those who played it. And MTV would not only entertain with music videos, but it would push activism, left-wing activism. Now all of a sudden AIDS was discovered. Cars began to be fast again. And rap was about to make its first appearance. Rap would arrive on a rhyme and a beat, a cunning rhyme, but as it progressed, it would become more violent, sexist, and filthy to the max. Rap would be renamed hip-hop in the 90s, and it would cross all lines of race and background as it addicted kids to its tough, angry message. Reagan was elected into office in the 80s, and his trickle-down economics and policies were slowly beginning to rebuild the economy and prosper. But the left wing had no intention of allowing America to know that. The left wing had now achieved real power and would deny any good which was done, especially by any conservative initiative. And since they now owned the media, they would share only what they wanted to share with America and the world. The bad news, the doom and gloom. And through the media, which the left wing had infiltrated, they overtook all facets of broadcasting. Not only the news channels, not only the newspapers, but the cable channels, the science channels, the discovery channels, the history channels, and various other channels. They would offer information to any who wanted. Only it had a left-wing spin. The powerful propaganda machine that they built had followed the pattern of Hitler's example. Hitler's example was first take over all the outlets of news and information and censor what you don't want to be heard, namely the truth. And now the left wing was fully entrenched in government as well. The old Democrats, who had stood for faith and against communist ideals, had died off or been supplanted by the new Democrats, who were the radicals of the 60s. Bands of former hippies, bands of socialist and communal living people, whose agendas were socialism and anti-Christian pursuits. And even when these people attained power and were told of the looming threats of terrorism, the left-wingers played it off as though it was fear-mongering. Here's an example. Former Vice President Al Gore, well, before he was Vice President, when he was Senator Gore, was warned in 1987 by then Colonel Oliver North that Osama bin Laden was a very dangerous threat and was massing power and would use his religion to strike America with terrorism. Colonel North said, if he is not dealt with, he will strike us. Now, Senator Gore laughed and scoffed at Colonel North's suggestion and said that Colonel North was making a big deal over nothing, and so nothing was done. Well, we all know what happened on 9/11 of 2001. Could it have been stopped? Maybe if Senator Gore, who had later become vice president, had listened, but who knows, maybe not. But it shows the deep partisan hatred these two parties have for each other. It shows the house divided, or better said, the country divided. It is ironic that Al Gore downplayed Osama bin Laden and his threat, but is the patriarch of global warming, which is an unverified, unsubstantiated theory come up with a small group of scientists. And it is a theory that sounds good to those who don't know the facts, those who are moved by knee-jerk reaction. We know that this earth goes through climate change naturally. It heats up and it gets warm. This is natural for the earth. But there's money to be made by sounding the alarm. Taxes can be levied, and these people know this. So now let's move on. We're beginning to reach the 1990s to the modern day. MTV now no longer plays music, but now is a forum of reality TV shows stressing sex, rap music, and the thug life. Rap is king, as white and Latino and Asian kids now dress and act as if they are street gang thugs from LA, no matter where they live, in suburbia or the ghetto. They are infected by this music and by MTV with a kind of black rage, because it's cool and iconic to them. It's tough. They have nothing to be mad about. They have been raised in the freest, most blessed nation in the world, where opportunity is aplenty, yet they act as though they are oppressed and as if they have nothing to lose by anything they do. And a new sect, a new group called the Goths, has shown its face. They've become chic, dressing in all black and lamenting being alive. Their appearance is that of a cross between vampires and transvestites, a mutation of the gay influence in the media, and the music and the fashion of the time. And gays have now reached a pinnacle of power. They protest and hold parades in major cities. They post videos on the internet. And the youth of this country, young impressionable minds, have been found by the left to be a fertile bed to plant seeds in. The left have used their full power to indoctrinate and poison the minds of our youth with hatred. Hatred for authority, disloyalty, conspiracy. The dumbing down of America has worked. It works successfully to change attitudes and opinions. It changes truth with propaganda and innuendo. They teach youth to be hopeless and to whine and complain, and blindly convince them that big government will take care of everything. And these left-wingers have more than mastered the use of cunning speech and innuendo. They dupe Americans into seeing things their way with the lies and propaganda that they spoon-feed America daily from the media, from the newspapers, from TV, from music, and from movies. They use labels like extreme and draconian and bigoted. and they get the easily duped to fall into their camp. If you're a Christian, you're an extremist and a right-wing wacko. If you're rich, you're evil and you must be punished. If you're a hard worker, you should feel guilty for not wanting to pay higher taxes to help those which the left labels as the needy and helpless. In reality, you'll pay higher taxes so that the left wing can use your money as gifts and entitlements to pander to whoever they want to label as poor and oppressed, regardless of the truth of the matter. In this way, they can buy votes and dupe the Americans they pander to into voting for them, as they claim to be the champions of the poor and disenfranchised. All the while, though, they are keeping those which they call them poor and enfranchised, unaware that they are keeping them in the gutter, for the purpose of using them as a poor voting demographic anytime they choose, by acting as though they represent them. And since they now hold the majority, they hold the office and the media, they will censor the truth, and whatever propaganda they wish to spew out will become the truth. It will be perceived as the truth by the uninformed American. The uninformed American who has enough trouble just trying to keep their heads above water in the day-to-day struggles of life, and in the bad economy created and orchestrated by the left, by their wasteful spending and pork. Now, I'm not saying that the right wing is not to blame for some of this. They most certainly are. They have not stood up nor held to the values of the GOP, and they have allowed a lot of this, and many of their own politicians are also corrupt and are on this gravy train of spending. But you see, the left knows that the average American is forgetful. They know that they have very little time to check facts and verify the truth, and that what they see on the TV and hear over the radio is generally what they will believe. And they know they can be easily manipulated through propaganda and lies. They can be made quick to judge and slow to understand. And so deception wins by calling itself change. But change to what? Socialism? Communism? One world government? Well, we know from the Bible that one world government will occur. But do we have to stand for communism? Well, that depends on America. It depends on if Americans wake up to the truth that they are being lied to and manipulated. It depends on whether they wake up and realize that these people are making right out to be wrong and wrong out to be right. They are intent, these leftists, upon taking this nation to socialism and breaking down Christian beliefs and ideals. Have we as Americans forgotten that socialist and communist nations have never been successful? They have never been able to feed their people. They have had to put up fences to keep their people in their countries. Remember the Berlin Wall? These people weren't fenced in because they stayed there by choice. They were fenced in because they had no freedoms. They could not worship. They could not pursue their lives' ambitions. They could not have peace of mind. And is this what we are voting into power? This kind of government? Let's do a quick rundown, shall we, of the things that this left-wing ideology, which is part of the four hidden dynasties, has brought to be. The four hidden dynasties: the educational system, the economy, the political, and the religious system. Where have they brought us to? Let's see where we stand today versus where we had been. And yes, some of this will be recapping. The left has successfully done away with prayer in school. They have stopped some schools in America from saying one nation under God in the Pledge of Allegiance. They have successfully introduced secular teachings into the schools and seen to it that now they are the only teachings. For example, they teach that man evolved from apes, while they deny creation by Almighty God. In fact, they will not even allow Almighty God's creation to be mentioned. Some will say, well, that's just not recognizing religion, and that's fair, isn't it? Well, is secularism not a religion? To teach kids that they evolved from apes is exactly the opposite of teaching creation. That is religion. That is doctrine. How would you answer if God was standing beside you if the question was asked, should creation be allowed to be taught in schools? They have stopped corporal punishment in schools, so that now students and teachers are at the mercy of disruptive, troublemaking thugs. They have legalized abortion by calling it choice. Imagine that. Murder a choice. They have removed references from God from government buildings. They have all but removed censorship from TV, so that now filth is commonplace. They have made Marxist programs in this country which allow those who won't work and won't better themselves to have almost as good as those who do work. They won't close our border to illegals who come here to work tax-free and receive welfare, WIC, and free housing, free school lunching, low-income housing. They are attempting even now to socialize medicine by making it universal. And why? For the most part, it already is universal. Whoever gets turned away from an emergency room nowadays? And if they do get turned away, they will sue with the help of the ACLU. Not to mention, these go to emergency rooms with things like common colds, scraped knees, ingrown toenails, or to get a sonogram to see if they are pregnant. And I might as well say to see if they are pregnant again. They of the left allow and enable this. They complain that healthcare costs and healthcare insurance prices are skyrocketing. Gee, why are they skyrocketing? Because the left is using taxpayer money to pay the bills of those who won't pay, or who can't pay, or those who are illegal and shouldn't even be here. They are causing the problem and acting as though they are innocent of all blame, and they don't understand why it's happening. Then they point their fingers at the other party and say, it's your fault. The left is currently enacting a bill into law which will make it a crime to teach God's word concerning homosexuality, even in church. By calling the Word of God, or the language used in the Word of God concerning that lifestyle, as hateful. In other words, they're calling God's Word hate speech. They have already spitefully twisted the real meaning of separation of church and state to mean something that it does not mean, but rather, what they make it mean is a manipulative tactic by which left-wingers can bully Christians. Likewise, they are drafting a bill, even now, called the Fairness in Broadcasting Act, which will make conservative views via talk shows, TV, and internet forums illegal. Free speech, anyone? Anyone? The left wing already holds the biggest information outlet in the world, the media. So if they cut the conservative view off, then all you'll get is their view. Whatever they want to spoon feed you. Now back in education, they have lowered grade point averages and education standards to where anyone can pass and not be left behind. They can pass whether they study or not, whether they try or not. And we don't want to hold them back because then they'll think they're ignorant. And that will hurt their little feelings. And there's more of an agenda to that than you know. The left are happy to turn out of schools illiterate pieces of clay which they can mold into anything they want. The left and the backwards interpretation of the law imprisoned 2 Border Patrol agents for doing their duty. But by the same token, allowed 21 illegal immigrants, non-Americans, to sue a West Texan American farmer because he held them prisoner until the Border Patrol arrived. Is that fair? They have done away with the death penalty in the majority of the states. And in the states where it still exists, it takes between 14 and 25 years to carry it out. Again, they defend the murderer, but the helpless unborn they ignore and allow to be killed. Because It's a choice. They charge Americans and corporations extra tax so that they can fight phantom mythical crises like global warming. Global warming, the theory of a mind-numbed person who stood by and allowed Osama bin Laden to escape into Afghanistan and to orchestrate 9/11. What brilliance. They won't allow America to drill for her own resources, like oil and coal, because tree huggers and overactive imaginations of the environmentalists and their alarmist stupidity make them hold up progress and technology. Well, you might kill the spotted owl, or you might endanger the striped trout. Most of the time, the things they say are endangered are not endangered. But then again, the average everyday American doesn't know that and doesn't go and check the facts. So they believe whatever they're spoon-fed. And so we remain dependent on foreign oil, and we remain at the whims of those foreign countries' pricing of that oil. Not to mention the left wants to take control, or what they call gun control, to a new level, which is against the Second Amendment rights of Americans. It will be gun control, all right, because only criminals will have the guns and they will be in control. Them or the Army, and the Army will be under the government control. And if the government is left-wing, then nothing will be able to stop them. You know, for crying out loud, they have even brainwashed Americans into believing that America orchestrated 9/11 against her own people. Do you realize just how suspicious and conspiracy-minded and misled you have to believe that kind of stupidity? For God's sake, can't anyone see that this is totalitarian communist fascism that we're heading into at high speed? Are we so blind till we can't see what's plainly before us? Just because they on the left say, that's not so. We're here to protect you and to help you. Doesn't the matter of fact mean anything anymore? You know, sometimes I think God has a good sense of humor, and He is willing to let us wallow in a pit of ignorance and stupidity. Because anyone who can't see what these four hidden dynasties, what this left wing are up to, is more than just blind. They're simply brainwashed. You know, I have not mentioned all the things here that the left does, but I've given you a pretty good idea. And you can see how these four hidden dynasties are knitted together and the power that they hold. They are taking ground from the Christian and giving it to everyone else. When the wishes of a few, the atheists and the secularists, outweigh the wishes of Christians, which are 86% of this country, then something is wrong. When justice is turned around so that the law-abiding citizen suffers while the criminal is released over and over and over and gets away with murder, then something is wrong. It is my prayer that you were not taken in by these systems, that you will seek God's counsel and seek out His truth, that you won't be misled, that you will ask God to bless your mind, that you will seek out the old scriptures and see that these things were prophesied to happen by God, so that you won't be deceived, because the real deception is soon upon us. And it will make the lies, the propaganda, and the innuendo of these four systems look like child's play. Thank you for listening. This has been Just Thoughts.